Thanks so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be back, if virtually, with our Westchester Audubon chapters. Um, as Anne mentioned, I grew up in White Plains, began birding in Westchester and Greenwich. Spent a lot of time at Greenwich Audubon in addition to places in Westchester. And now I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And I study how migratory birds are responding to global change. I want to first start out, give you a little bit of further background about me. I have had an eye for birds for some time, as Anne mentioned, even before my teenage years, apparently. Thanks to my mom for documenting some of my first words and sentences. And my conscious interest in ornithology sparked in really about third grade, thanks to a teacher, Mrs. Kanka, at Church Street Elementary School in White Plains. And there, Mrs. Kanka had birds woven into the classroom curriculum through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's classroom feeder watch program. And so that's when I first became familiar with Cornell. So it's fitting that I'm back there today. And I really still remember then the excitement of learning the puzzle of bird identification and collecting data from the feeder watching that would be used by scientists at Cornell. Spent a lot of time birding in Westchester, including at Hook Mountain on the left, pretty old photo of me. I think the one on the right is a local trip, but I'm not sure quite where. I did some Christmas bird counts, including in Rye. Saw Gail and Tom on the participants. I think I have Gail to thank for some of these photos. And I spent some time, as I mentioned, at the Audubon Center in Greenwich doing some hawk watching after school, in high school in particular. Some of my other birding experiences involved expanding my horizons through camps in Colorado, an American Birding Association camp, and the renowned Hog Island camp in Maine. And it was really thanks to the support of many of our local community that I got to benefit from these experiences, including a scholarship from the Sawmill River Audubon's Larry Light Memorial Scholarship Fund. So thank you all for contributing to that and some of these formative experiences. In my later high school years, I became more drawn into the scientific research in addition to recreational birding. And so in Westchester, one project I did involved putting recording devices out at a number of our preserves, including marshlands, pictured on the left here, Lenoir, Audubon Greenwich, Westmoreland. So thanks to, I think, some of you who helped me in that effort. Then I ended up at Cornell as an undergraduate, and I had many wonderful experiences there. Some great birding experiences, like participating in the World Series of Birding in New Jersey, and a number of aspects of science research, including in the lab, in the field. This is me recording a Connecticut warbler in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and trying to do my best to hide from the mosquitoes there, which were quite something. But it really felt at Cornell like the sky was the limit as a young student there. So it was a really great experience. Then I ended up at Oxford for my PhD, and did a lot of typical British things there, like wearing white bow ties and wrangling the Queen's swans. The Queen apparently owns all the swans on the Thames by law, and even got to meet David Attenborough briefly, so had a good time there. And my research, it focuses on a lot of aspects of bird migration, and I get to work in the field, in the lab, and I really enjoy applying computational approaches and lots of exciting analytical techniques in my work, which I'll tell you about today. But movement, which is what I'm most interested in, movement spans the globe and touches every aspect of a bird's biology. So I like to approach my research questions about movement from many perspectives and disciplines and scales, spatial scales, for example. Before I begin talking about my research, I want to recognize just a few of the many mentors that have guided me and given me so much over the years. These are some of the people who helped facilitate my research in the last several years and have been really instrumental in the work that you'll hear about shortly. So in the next 45 minutes, 50 minutes or so, I want to talk about how migratory birds are responding to global change through movement. I first want to talk about an example of ongoing migratory change in the wild and how I have been studying that. And then I want to look at an important recent change in our world today, the proliferation of light pollution and what that means for migratory birds. And then I want to talk about some of the next steps that I'm exploring now and how I hope to advance the frontier of ecology research and bird migration monitoring. So a little background on migratory birds and how they work on the inside. Many migratory birds, including the common migratory songbirds that you think of when you think of migratory birds, they have innate inherited migratory programs that enable them through instinct to complete migration without being shown the way, which is something I found quite fascinating for a long time. Evidence for the existence of these programs, these internal programs, comes from a number of sources. And Eurasian blackcaps, which are a European bird species, have been a really important species used for research to learn about these fascinating aspects of bird migration. Blackcaps are small birds. They're insect and fruit eating, and they're about the size of our song sparrows, about 20 grams. They're also similarly skulky, and they breed across Western Europe. And some early research in Germany brought blackcaps into the lab, birds from different populations that migrated in different directions. So for example, one group of blackcaps migrates southwest for the winter from Western Europe. And the directions on the plot all pointing southwest that you see are the individual directions that the researchers determined from their collection of southwesterly migrating birds from lab experiments. And they also brought birds into the lab from a different population that migrated southeast. And then over a couple of years, they crossbred them and looked at how their offspring behaved and found that their offspring had intermediate or southbound migratory directions. And so this was some of the first experimental evidence that something as complex as a bird's migratory direction is actually inherited. But given that it seems like these behaviors are programmed to some extent, that raises an important question, which is, in the face of rapid environmental change, how can a bird with a programmed migratory direction or programmed migratory behavior, how quickly can they respond to these rapid changes that we're seeing in the world today, from climate change to land use change to all sorts of other impacts we're having on the world? So to look at this further, I dug into blackcaps during my time in Europe. Here we're looking at a map of Western Europe, or of Europe and in Northern Africa. And blackcaps breed across Western Europe and migrate south for the winter. Here we're seeing the tracks of individual birds that were tracked across their migrations. The empty circles at the top are the breeding locations where the birds were captured, and those filled darker circles at the bottom are the approximate wintering locations of each of those individuals, connected by a solid line. So we can see especially that these wintering locations of these birds are around the Mediterranean in Southern Europe and Northern Africa. And we got this information about these birds from miniature tracking devices called light level geolocators, which we can affix to the back of these birds. They contain a clock, a battery, a camera, a light sensor, not a camera, And these light sensors, they record ambient light levels from which we can deduce a bird's location, given the time of sunrise and sunset and the length of the day, the time of solar noon. And this allows us to pinpoint approximately where these birds are on the face of the earth. So again, they winter primarily in the Mediterranean. But blackcap migration is increasingly changing. This is a video of a blackcap on a suet feeder in the UK in winter. And the UK is not part of the regular wintering range of these birds, which is highlighted in blue. It's not a subtropical Mediterranean zone with habitat like olive orchards that these blackcaps love in Portugal and Spain in the winter. So increasingly, though, these birds have been spending the winter in places like England and increasing quite dramatically. These are recent counts of blackcaps in Kent, a county in England, and we can see since about 1990, they've really increased quite dramatically. So in a species like the blackcap, where we know migration is encoded to a certain extent, what explains such rapid change in their migratory behavior? And what are the ecological consequences of this change? So I've been working on studying blackcaps, especially through my time in the UK during my PhD in Oxford. And this work included capturing birds in, for example, mist nets and cage traps, fitting them with colored leg bands like these, which are allow them to be individually identifiable in the field. This is a blue, metal red bird, for example. And of course, I fitted them with light level geolocators to figure out where they were going on their migrations, and took a variety of measurements, like measurements of the bill, and of the wing. And so this study allowed me to really understand the close ties between birds and humans in this suburban and sometimes urban setting. So these environments, these backyard gardens, were the places that were most reliable for finding and catching blackcaps. And you've just watched a video of a bird that was foraging in a remote-controlled cage trap, which I used in my research, and in particular, eating some homemade Victoria sponge cake, which the homeowner at the site has been feeding his blackcaps for decades and swears by. I want to note that this bird has a brown cap, not a black cap, and that's because this is a female. So over the course of the years of the study, thanks to many participants in British gardens like in this site, I was able to compile about 10,000 observations of blackcaps in gardens, and this allowed me to look at how these birds are behaving in these human-dominated settings. But first, I want to talk about some of the results from my research and what I learned. I first looked at what conditions were associated with these birds relying on bird feeders. I found in my research first that they occur in gardens and are more reliant on feeders when it's cold outside. And this plot shows on the x-axis air temperature, unfortunately in Celsius, but we can see colder air temperatures towards the left end of the x-axis are associated with larger predicted values here of the probability that a blackcap is in a garden. So in other words, the probability that it's spending its time foraging at a bird feeder. So colder weather, more blackcaps in the gardens. Similarly, when there's more precipitation, more rain, we see more blackcaps in the garden. So on the whole, this tells us that blackcaps are more reliant on supplementary food provided by people during inclement weather. I also wanted to look at how, if you pardon, okay, there we go. Computer was spinning a bit. How blackcaps in their traditional wintering areas, they're relying on ephemeral food resources like olive trees and fruiting olive trees. And so they're moving from place to place, trying to find this food. And as a result, in the Mediterranean, again, the traditional wintering area for these birds, they don't typically come back to the same site in subsequent years. Measures of site fidelity or site faithfulness are quite low. Blackcaps are generally not coming back to the same site. That's very different in the human-dominated environment of the British Isles. Here we find, and I found through my research, that these blackcaps show a much higher site faithfulness, that as many as 40% of adult blackcaps are coming back to their beloved feeders and gardens year after year. So this is a very substantial change to how these birds are interacting with their environment in the winter. And so this is really important for understanding how environmental change caused directly by people are impacting blackcap biology. And these effects extend not only to their movement behavior, but also to their physiology, their internal biology, and their morphology, how their skeleton and feathers are structured. We find that blackcaps frequenting gardens, they tend to be in good body condition, meaning their muscles are robust, they're getting enough food. And at the same time, though, we find that they're fairly lean. They are not carrying very much fat. If you've ever held been fortunate to have held a bird in the winter, especially one that's coming to a bird feeder, and looked at its fat stores, for example, through a bird banding experience, these birds like to store fat in the winter to buffer against difficult conditions, a cold snap, for example, which will require them to use up more energy to stay warm. And yet the blackcaps in the gardens are not keeping these large fat stores like we would expect. And so this strategy of having less fat, low fat in the cold winter is a little bit risky and requires a reliable food source to allow these birds to make it from day to day without relying on those internal stores of energy. But of course, blackcaps in the UK have these kinds of reliable food sources in the form of bird feeders. We also found that there are some interesting patterns with how the bird's wings and bills were structured, really. We found that birds frequenting gardens, these blackcaps, tended to have longer bills and rounder wingtips. Now, birds that tend to be more sedentary, to stay in one place and not move around very much, they, over time, tend to evolve rounder wings to emphasize and take advantage of increased maneuverability over flight efficiency. So if they're not flying as much, it's much better to be able to move around in an agile way and, for example, evade predators. And so we're seeing those kinds of effects at this small scale as well. And the fact that blackcaps spending time in these gardens had longer bills, we think is linked to their food. We know that this kind of response in another bird species in the UK has been the result of reliance on bird feeders, that this longer bill allows them to have a more generalist diet and take advantage of the variety of foods that are available in garden and backyard feeding stations. So these are patterns that we saw for adult blackcaps and are really interesting. But young birds, juveniles, are doing something intriguingly different. Instead of having good body condition and lower fat stores, we see that these birds, the first year birds shown in orange, tend to have poorer body condition and have higher fat stores. In other words, they're not doing so well, but they're taking on a lot of fat. And we think that they're using gardens, backyards, to buffer against difficult conditions, that these backyards may be serving as somewhat of a lifeline for these inexperienced birds. So a lot that we can deduce from these observations of birds in gardens, which is really interesting. Of course, I was fascinated by blackcap migration and really wanted to know, where are these birds coming from? Are they spending all year round in the UK, or are they coming from elsewhere? And we found that instead of spending the summer in Europe and migrating south, these birds are migrating north and northwest for the winter, migrating from breeding areas in Central and Western Europe north to the UK for the winter, instead of commuting a short distance over to Nice or Barcelona. They're going to London, which is somewhat surprising. And given what we know about the mechanisms of migration in birds that I described earlier, that it's inherited, it's likely that this behavior is actually encoded into the genetic makeup of these birds, that there's a genetic basis for this switch in behavior. Unfortunately, I haven't found exactly what that is quite yet, but I'm working on it. So I hope to have some insights at some point in the future into how this works internally. But for now, a really cool pattern to observe in the wild. So there are many possible advantages for this somewhat odd behavior of blackcaps migrating north to spend the winter in the UK. Somewhat paradoxically, even despite the fact that they're migrating to a colder area in the winter, because of all of the food that is provided by British bird lovers in the winter, there are estimates that every other household in the UK, 50% of households have bird feeders. But this might actually improve their winter survival over a more traditional wintering area that requires the birds to search for fruit and other ephemeral food sources. This also allows them, the backyard bird feeding allows them to quickly fuel for migration when they want to head back to the breeding area in the spring. We know that blackcaps, they leave their backyards in the UK in late winter, in mid-March to late March and even to early April. And they arrive back on the breeding grounds in Western Europe only about 5 days after leaving their gardens. And so this suggests that any benefits they're receiving from their gardens, from the bird feeders in the winter may carry over to give them benefits in the crucial early part of the breeding season. And so all of this may lead you to wonder, and led us to wonder, are they migrating earlier back to the breeding grounds in spring as a result? And indeed, that's exactly what we find that they're doing. Blackcaps migrating from the UK back to Europe, instead of, compared to those migrating from the Mediterranean, from further south, they arrive about 10 days earlier. We have estimates of the start, the middle, and the end of migration being about 10 days earlier. And so this 10 days may not seem like much in the grand scheme of a 365-day year, but birds in spring, they do a lot of things really quickly, especially migratory birds. We know that blackcaps, like many migratory birds, they may arrive back on the breeding grounds and form pairs, find a mate, only a few days after arrival. And then only a few days after that, say 2 to 5 days, they've already built a nest. And then they can start incubating, which lasts 11 to 12 days. So a bird that arrives with a 10-day head start may actually be able to establish a good territory, find a mate, and build a nest all before another bird that arrived 10 days later. So this is a really plausible advantage for this kind of 10-day head start. Whether, to what extent these UK wintering blackcaps are taking advantage of these possibilities is really yet to be conclusively shown, but these are a number of really plausible explanations for why this somewhat counterintuitive change in migratory behavior has been increasing in frequency. So one part of my research, this really fascinating example of ongoing migratory change. Now I want to talk about another important change in our world, the proliferation of light pollution and how that impacts migratory birds. First, I want to talk a little bit generally about nocturnal migration. Of all the bird species in the world, about 20% of them, conservatively, are migratory. We're learning about bird movements more and more all the time, and this official number is quite low. But conservatively, about 20% of bird species in the world are traditionally are migratory in the traditional sense. In North America, we're in a temperate region, it gets cold in the winter, and about 70% of our birds are migratory. And although they're active primarily at night, the vast majority of these birds, 80% or 4 billion in total, that's billion with a B, these are nocturnal migrants. They undertake their migrations at night. There are a lot of potential advantages for why these birds are migrating at night. One important advantage is that they can benefit from cooler air temperatures. It's cooler at night, and just like we sweat and lose water through sweat, birds pant, and if it's warm, they lose a lot of water through cooling. So migrating at night allows them to conserve water, which is important on longer migratory flights, especially. Those of us who have been on planes recently will know that stable atmospheres are much nicer for flying. And during the day, the uneven heating of the Earth's surface causes turbulence in the atmosphere. And for a small bird, that can really cause the bird to be blown around in the atmosphere when turbulence is strong. So flying at night when the atmosphere is more stable allows them to avoid this problem. Of course, there are no hawks flying around at night, so that's an advantage as well. And we think that birds may benefit from the navigational cues available at night. We know birds can navigate by the stars and the Earth's magnetic field. And there's even some intriguing evidence that birds' magnetic sense may be, or may only function or best function under low light conditions, such as the conditions at night. So a number of possible advantages for such nocturnal migratory behavior. So given this reliance on the night sky, how does light pollution impact nocturnal bird migration? Well, light pollution is, of course, impacting not only birds, but organisms across the tree of life. And humans, we are by no means immune from light pollution. In North America, over 99% of people are living under light polluted skies, and 80% can no longer see the Milky Way at night. And so that has impacts. On this image, I'm showing a picture of phenomenon you're all no doubt familiar with, the tribute in light, a light display in New York City that is a memorial to the lives lost on September 11th, 2001. And each year on the stage, lights are shined up into the sky. They're extremely bright. They're seen up to 100 kilometers away. And so what does this all do, or how does it all appear to a migratory bird that is flying through the sky and hasn't experienced anything like this in its life or even evolutionary history? Well, now this video is taken beneath the lights, right beneath the tribute in lights, looking skyward. And if you can make out all of the, hopefully it renders through Zoom okay, all of these white dots moving around on the screen, these are migratory birds that are essentially trapped in a state of disorientation in the light beams. So in studying this phenomenon, one of our first questions was, how far does the effect of these lights extend around the light beams? Are we seeing just the tip of the iceberg, or are we seeing what's happening? And how many birds are being attracted to these light beams? Are they being drawn in from far away, or are these birds just individuals that happen to encounter the beams and get trapped, get stuck, as it were, in the lights? So to look at this, we turn to a tool called radar, Doppler radar. The US operates 143 weather radars in the contiguous US, the lower 48 states. And these are used by the Weather Service for tracking rain, tracking the snowstorm that I understand is going to hit the coast in the next few days. But it can also track migratory birds. These radars send out a pulse of energy into the sky, and any birds that are flying in the area of airspace that the radar is sampling will reflect energy back to the radar, just like a raindrop. Birds, of course, are flying roughly 70% water, and so they reflect energy just like a raindrop does, or at least similarly. And so we had a radar, there's a radar on Long Island about 100 kilometers away from Manhattan. And when that radar beam travels and intercepts the area above Manhattan, it samples the area between 700 and 2,400 meters above the ground. So any birds that are flying around in that area will know. This is what the radar returns look like. And I want to walk you through this. So here we're seeing the outline of southern Manhattan. And so it's a fairly zoomed in image. And the tribute in light is this white dot in the center. And the uniform blues in the image show that migration is fairly uniform at this point in time. There's not much interesting going on. This is about 10 p.m. the night of September 11th, 2015, and the lights are off at this point in time. But then just 20 minutes later, the lights are turned on and the picture changes dramatically. We see a huge concentration of birds within 500 meters of the light beams. We estimate about 16,000 birds in this area. And over the course of our study, which took place over seven nights of this event, we estimated over 1 million birds were impacted by this light display. But fortunately, there's an exemplary partnership at this site, which means that the lights are turned off for 20 minutes if too many birds become trapped in the beams. And so there's negligible mortality at the Tribune light. Very few birds actually die as a result. And so this is great. It's, I think, a really encouraging example of advocates and event organizers working together to solve this problem. But this is not the case in many situations, especially when we're talking about buildings and lights. Of course, with a building, we have light and glass, the glass separating the bird from the light. So a bird attracted to the light often encounters glass. And as a result, we have birds that are dying from collisions with illuminated structures like buildings. These fatal collisions represent hundreds of millions of deaths annually in the US alone, and these are preventable deaths. And so I worked recently to try and disentangle this collision phenomenon and understand just how much lights are contributing to this problem. We focused on Chicago, which is a city that our previous research identified as the city in the US that's likely to expose the most birds to the most light pollution, the most nocturnally migrating birds specifically. And in Chicago, we focused on McCormick Place, which is a convention center highlighted in red here. It's a low-rise building, only about 3 stories tall. But what is really useful about McCormick Place for our research is that colleagues of mine at the Field Museum in Chicago, especially Dave Willard, have walked the perimeter of this building for literally decades, collecting dead birds nearly every day during migration, and also keeping track of which lights in the building were illuminated. So this gives us a really useful window onto how lights are impacting and leading to bird collisions. I'm going to show a few more charts summarizing our results here. First, perhaps unsurprisingly, we found that the more birds that are migrating on a given night, the more birds found dead the next morning because of collision. So the x-axis shows a measure of migration from our radars. So higher values indicate more birds migrating that particular night. And of course, higher y-axis means higher bird collision. So more migration, more collisions. That's pretty intuitive. We also see that the more lights that are turned on in the building, which is shown on the x-axis, also the more birds collide. So we see support for this hypothesis that the more lights, or that light is causing bird collisions, essentially. But there's an important nuance to this relationship. When we look at individual windows and big window bays at this building, we find that when the windows are darkened, when the lights are turned off or shades are drawn, that across the board, the predicted number of collisions or observed collisions are very low. Not many birds are striking those windows and dying. But when the lights behind that individual window are turned on, the amount of birds striking the window jumps dramatically. And so this suggests that bird collisions are occurring on the scale of the individual window. And so importantly, turning off lights behind an individual window or drawing your blinds is likely to meaningfully reduce bird mortality, especially in areas where we have big glass facades, bright lights, and lots of birds migrating. So with our study, we were able to predict what would have happened over the last 20 years, the amount of time that collisions at McCormick Place have been monitored to this degree. What would have happened over those last 20 years if more lights had been turned off? Now, on the average night, about 75% of lights are on in this building. And we predicted, using our statistical models based on our analyses, that if those lights had been reduced to 50%, if half the lights had been turned off, that half of all birds that died could have been saved, that collisions could have been reduced by over 50%, and 5,000 birds or more would not have died. But things could have been a lot worse if all of the lights had been turned on every night. Our statistical models showed that mortality could have been 75% higher. So all of this leads to a fairly simple solution, which is, of course, to turn off lights. But unfortunately, when we're talking about translating science to action, to changing people's behavior, it's not so simple. But there are some encouraging tidbits. Our research has led to a great deal of discussion and media attention, including in Chicago. Laura Bush wrote an editorial in Texas for our Lights Out program, or associated with the Lights Out program at Cornell. And overall, we're seeing some encouraging actions on the legislative front as well. So Illinois last year passed the Bird Safe Buildings Act. And just last month in December, New York City passed Lights Out legislation. And only a couple of weeks ago, New York State has introduced Lights Out legislation. It hasn't passed yet, but it was introduced in the legislature. So these are all encouraging steps, and I hope to see more of these in this coming year. One tool for targeting where and when it's important to turn off lights is something called a lights out alert, a lights out forecast. If we can predict when and where birds are going to be migrating, we can advise people to turn off lights and advise birders when and where they can find migrating birds. This brings me to my work forecasting bird migration. The image at the top of the screen is a composite image of all of the radars across the lower 48 states. And all of the green and blue circular patterns in the east are lots and lots of migrating birds. This is a typical pattern of migrating birds that we see on the radars, and I've highlighted a few of those circular patterns. So this is a night with heavy bird migration in the east. And if we link these observations from our radar network with the concurrent observations from weather sensors, like the air temperature, the winds, the north-south winds, the east-west winds, humidity, location, many other variables, we can start to figure out statistically what conditions lead to bird migration across the country. And then we can predict how those may manifest in the future. So to do this, we take a lot of radar data from 23 years. We combine that with weather information across the country, and we use machine learning tools to learn the associations between migration and weather. And then we can take a weather forecast, your standard weather forecast from, say, 3 days from now, 5 days from now. For example, there's a weather forecast called the Global Forecasting System. If we take a weather forecast and apply our model to it, then we can transform a weather forecast into a bird migration forecast, which might look something like this, with the red colors indicating heavy likely or a large likelihood of migration through, in this case, the central United States. Just to give a snapshot of what that might look like in detail, here's a case of a migration forecast predicting heavy migration through the central flyway. And when we look at what happened on that particular night, so in this case, we were predicting many as 178 million migratory birds. When we look at what happened, we see these heavy circular patterns that, as I mentioned, represent birds primarily in the central flyway. So this was a fairly good forecast. So we can apply these forecasts across the US, and you can view our migration forecasts during the migration season daily on our website, birdcast.info, which receives about 65,000 views weekly during the migration season. This is a consortium of Cornell, Colorado State University, UMass Amherst. And this is an idea of what a migration forecast map looks like. Here, it's a bit of a different color scheme. I apologize from the previous slides, but these warmer colors represent more birds. And in this case, we're expecting more birds migrating in the Dakotas, essentially. And then we can convert our migration forecasts into a lights out alert and layer on top of our migration forecasts where we are advising people in particular to turn off lights. So on this particular night, we have a medium advisory out for Bismarck, North Dakota, and that whole orange portion of the upper Great Plains. So again, you can go on birdcast.info and type in your location and view our migration forecast for the next 3 nights. It's not live currently, but it will be live for the coming spring migration, I believe March 15th. So overall, I've talked about how light pollution is dangerous for birds, but encouragingly, it's also a problem that we can solve. All it takes is a flip of a light switch. So through research, outreach, and ultimately legislation, we are seeing differences being made in this important issue. Okay, now lastly, I want to talk about some of the next steps that I'm taking in my research. So I talked about radar and how we can use radar to monitor bird migration. Now, radar is really useful for looking at migration across large spatial scales and even small spatial scales, like this image from the turbulent in light that you may recall from earlier in the talk. But radar has an important weakness, and that's that we can't learn anything about the individual birds that are migrating. There's no species information in radar data. And so that's where acoustic monitoring can come in. I'm actually using some of the data that I collected in marshlands back in 2010 or so when I was in high school, which I showed a picture of the monitoring device earlier in the talk. So this is really fun for me. But acoustic monitoring, that these billions of birds that migrate at night, they each give nocturnal, or many of them at least, many species give nocturnal flight calls or short vocalizations as they're migrating overhead. And if we can deploy an array of microphones across the country, we can tune into these migratory birds in real time and detect which species are migrating overhead. Warblers and sparrows and thrushes and cuckoos and many other species. So to take advantage of this, and overcome one of the key limitations here, which is just that it takes a lot of human effort and experience to identify and count and monitor these acoustic recordings. I'm working with engineers at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology to develop machine learning tools to automatically do this. I hope many of you have downloaded the Merlin Bird ID app to your smartphone. Merlin is an app developed by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and it can identify pictures, photos of birds impressively accurately. And now, in the last few months, they've released Merlin Sound ID, which is quite spectacularly impressive. You can turn on the app, press a button, and have your phone listen to a bird that's singing or calling, and more often than not, it will tell you what the bird was. And they're continuing to improve this all the time. So I encourage you to check it out if you haven't downloaded the Merlin app. But with my research, I'm working with the Merlin team to take some of their sound identification technology and translate it to this migration monitoring framework. And so we can use it to monitor the species and individuals migrating overhead. And so I envision this being really useful where we don't have much radar coverage for understanding how birds are migrating, interacting individually during migration. And so I hope that in the next few years, we'll see more and more microphones put on roofs of buildings and across the country, an entire network of acoustic sensors that will be telling us in real time a lot about the birds that are migrating overhead. And if you want to get involved in this now, you can contact me and I can give you some pointers for how to get set up with a microphone and monitoring station. Unfortunately, it's not all linked together live yet, but that's the goal. I also love in the future, an idea of mine is to hopefully put microphones on birds, like the backpacks that the blackcaps wore, the geolocators to track their migrations, to actually learn about how they're communicating and interacting during migration. And finally, I've also been working on trying to bring together lots of different aspects of big data that tell us about migration. I've talked about radar, about acoustics. Of course, people are tracking individual birds with GPS trackers and satellite trackers. And currently, there's not a great way to integrate all these data sources together and give the best possible picture of what's going on across the continent. So I'm working with the computer scientist at UMass Amherst, Dan Sheldon, to create this model called BirdFlow, where we take citizen science observations from the eBird database. I'd encourage you to check out eBird, submit your observations to eBird if you aren't already. We could take observations from eBird. This is showing the progression of observations of wood thrush through a spring. And we can model, we can infer how individual wood thrushes are behaving even without having individual tracking data. So we can estimate how an individual might be migrating. We can look at the migratory connectivity of these populations. Where do birds that breed in the Northeast spend the winter? Where do birds that breed in the Midwest spend the winter? How do those differ? We can get those information. And we can make predictions, forecasts about where an individual, let's say on the Yucatan Peninsula on April 15th, where it might be 1 week from now, 3 weeks from now, 6 weeks from now. And so these kinds of tools have a range of applications, both in science and conservation. One thing we're looking into right now, actually just in the last week, is whether we can use this technology to help target avian influenza prevention by helping, for example, poultry farmers target their biosurveillance and prevention measures, disease prevention measures, when sick birds may be migrating or passing through their area, species that are likely to be carrying or had a higher risk of carrying highly pathogenic avian influenza, which has actually just been detected in North America this year. So there might be an outbreak next winter, advance warning. So today I've talked a lot about 3 aspects of my research. An ongoing example of migratory change, how blackcaps are birds with innate migratory programs, yet we can still see tremendous flexibility in this species, which is really encouraging for birds like blackcaps and other species that will need to increasingly respond and respond increasingly to environmental change. We also saw how blackcaps are influenced by humans and by bird feeding and by climate change, not only in their migrations, but in their broader biology, their physiology, even their morphology, their migratory behavior, and so on. I also talked about how light pollution is a danger for birds, but it's really a problem that we can solve. I think one of the most solvable problems facing birds, much easier to solve than habitat loss or global warming. And that we're making a difference in this using research, leading to outreach, and ultimately through legislation. And finally, I hope maybe in the coming years to come back and talk about how I've helped advance a new subfield of acoustic aeroecology, using sound to help learn about what birds are doing as they migrate through the sky, how they use the atmosphere. And finally, that now I think is a really exciting time to integrate lots of different sources of data and create models that give us an incredibly integrative picture of behavior, of movement behavior across a continent. So with all of these massive data sets, miniaturized tracking devices, and machine learning tools, we're really reaching an ever better understanding of this vast, dynamic, and imperiled natural phenomenon that is bird migration. Thank you for listening. I'd be very happy to take any questions. And if you would like to contact me, there's my email address, or you can find me on Twitter as well. Thank you.